Well, thank you all very much for coming to our session. We'd like to encourage you to come on down to the front row. We won't put you on the spot, ask you any questions or anything like that, but there's plenty of room. And if you are waiting for the important people to come, you are the important people. So thank you very much for coming. So I am Amy Wood, the head of technical services at the Center for Research Libraries, and I'm joined by Stephanie Orpham, the director of publisher relations at Portico, and Craig Van Dyke, the executive director of CLOCKSS. And as I said, thank you very much for coming to our session to talk about the collaboration, our collaboration, to preserve the long tail of publishers' publications. And before I go on, I'm having a bit of an awkward moment with this, so I think I'm going to pick this up. It'll be a little bit better. So just to tell you a little bit more about who we are, Portico and CLOCKSS are the leading community-based digital preservation services for scholarly materials. Both have global footprints and have been operating for 10 to 15 years. They work with academic libraries and scholarly publishers to ensure future access to scholarly materials. So really probably the best people you could talk to about preserving the long tail of e-resources. And the Center for Research Libraries is an international consortium of over 200 member libraries. We were founded in 1949, so we have been preserving and providing access to essential research material for almost 70 years. Whoops. So for our agenda today, I'll be giving you an overview of CRL's new data-centered approach to identifying and preserving the critical course of humanities and social sciences print journals. Stephanie will explain the challenges in chasing the long tail of e-publishers and provide information about ways in which CLOCKSS and Portico and CRL propose to work together. And Craig will give you some insight into the role of other related resources. So here's kind of an overview of CRL's evolution into a sort of data-driven approach to print preservation. You know, for the first 50 years, we really were focused on being a central repository for a group of libraries, which was ever increasing in number, but still, we stored the material and we provided access to it in whatever current way library world was using. But in 2003, we hosted a conference called the Preserving American Print Resources, and this was really a pivotal moment in CRL's evolution. It was a conference that was was strategic planning, and CRL was hoping to get some direction in where we would go, beyond that sort of central repository. And we did. We were charged with two things. One, strengthening the network of institutions that was involved with print archiving and shared print resources. And the other one was to increase the amount of information that collection decision makers had to work with, and to encourage them and to promote their sharing of information so that we would all learn together. And so two important things came out of that related to this, although there were a lot of other projects that CRL has been involved in. And that was the PAN Forum and the Paper Registry. And the PAN Forum is a forum or a meeting where we, in conjunction with ALA, we meet twice a year, where folks involved with print archiving are sharing information, best practices, and have questions to ask the community. And the Paper Registry records information about the holdings in serial print repositories or archives. So with that information that we gained from the PAN Forum and the Paper Registry, we held another conference called the At-Risk Forum in 2015 and shared what we had learned with the community. And essentially what we had learned is, despite the enormous amount of investment in print archiving, we had actually preserved a very small percentage of the overall corpus. You know, we were estimating that there were about 5 million journals, and we had I think we had barely reached 100,000, at least the ones that had been registered in the paper database. So this was, of course, of huge concern, and there were a lot of ideas about how to attempt to preserve the full corpus. So CRL's solution was to leverage what had already been done at the library. So rather than, because we felt a sense of urgency, rather than take the time to figure out what the perfect list is, the perfect group of libraries to work on it, whatever, just leverage the work that had already been done at, you know, important research institutions. And so that began our Critical Corpus project. And this was something we began in 2016, a small but very much appreciated grant from the Mellon Foundation to define the costs and the requirements for preserving this universe, understanding what it is, and deciding what the critical corpus within that universe was. So our starting point was to aggregate the records from a variety of institutions, both public and private, and the information that we had in paper. And we aggregated about 2.5 million records. And within that, we pulled together about 463,000 humanities and social sciences titles. And we were focused on the humanities and social sciences because CRL already has a solid relationship with the Linda Hall Library to preserve and provide access to essential science material. So an outcome of this project, it wasn't something we went in looking for, but we realized that there was actually a very small amount of the material that was in digital form. And less than 2% of that was actually preserved in CLOCKSS and Portico. A big portion of it, of course, is in HathiTrust, and that is a really important means of getting access to the material. But CRL is really concerned about preserving the digital because we feel that the print preservation is limited and not sustainable without digital, unless you couple it with digital access. I think, you know, since, you know, in the past 30 or 40 years, since there have been sort of organized groups or efforts to preserve print, we always see that they are limited by institutional, you know, not exactly whims, but financial concerns, administrative, you know, limitations, and all of those other things. So really coupling the print with the digital is really essential to the preservation for that. So I'll turn it over to Stephanie, and she'll talk about some of the challenges of doing that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just want to talk a little bit about where CLOCKSS and Portico have been focusing their efforts to date, and then get in a little bit into how we hope we can work with, kind of jump off the project that CRL has done to help us better prioritize digital preservation efforts. CLOCKSS and Portico are both, as you know, community-based preservation services. We have the support of both the academic library community and the scholarly publishing community. So we're really obliged to be trying to preserve as much digital content as possible from across the broad spectrum of scholarly publishing, from the very small to the very large, commercial, nonprofit, university presses, the whole ball of wax. We're really ultimately at the service of the library community to make sure as much of the content that you're using is preserved. Having been at this for 10+ years, we've been focusing for the last several years on the long tail of publishers, which we define as small publishers with 10 or fewer titles. We were very lucky to, in the very early days, get the majority of the very large, all of the very large publishers and most of the medium to large publishers participating in our services and helping us get started. But there's a very, very, very large selection of smaller publishers out there that we've been focusing on. Content within this long tail of publishers is often more at risk due to the sometimes precarious nature of the publishing entities, which can often be just departments within universities putting out a single journal. So that means that the preservation imperative for those titles is very high. However, there are challenges to working with the very small publishers. One aspect is that there are many more long-tail publishers than can be managed. You know, when you're talking about working with thousands of publishers to get 1,000 publishers to get maybe 1,500 titles in, that's very different than working with one large publisher that's going to give you 1,500 titles. Another issue is that often these smaller publishers are obscure and we don't know that they exist, or if we do know they exist, it's a little more difficult to figure out who is the right person to be talking to about preservation and can make the decision to join one of our services. It can also be costly to work with these small publishers. One aspect of this is that there's just more communication involved and outreach efforts involved in trying to reach out to these smaller publishers. So that's one aspect of cost, but also it usually requires a little bit more effort to get the content coming in consistently in the format we need, and that the deposits, even if they start, continue to come to us. So that requires a little more work on the technical side as well as the publisher management side of things when you're working with small publishers. This slide is just going to give a little bit of a look at what we're talking about in terms of the small publishers. On the top left-hand side, I just give some numbers from various lists. The CRL critical corpus that we've been talking about, the slice that covered digital, Crossref, and Ulrich's. I believe it's from active titles, the Ulrich number, but anywhere between 6,500 to 9,500 publishers exist in this space. And you can see that of those publishers, it's a relatively small amount that are preserving in CLOCKSS and Portico currently. So we're really interested in looking at ways to significantly narrow that gap. So the start is trying to engage with you here and present our ideas and hopefully get some feedback, as well as taking the momentum forward within our three organizations. You can see on the chart, in terms of the amount across the publishers that CLOCKSS and Portico have signed, about 67% fall into this long tail category. 37% of those have just one title, 30% 2 to 10. And then you can see that about a third of the publishers that we're working with are in that larger category, having 10 or more titles. So some of the strategies that we've been using to get at this long tail of publishers, the small publishers, are targeting publishers using known platforms. If publishers are using hosting their content in a manner that we're familiar with and the exports are coming consistently, that makes it very easy for us to work with them, and it also puts them more in a likely situation of not having to do so much work on their end where they might not have the resources. So that's an area that we've been targeting. Expanding existing relationships really is about the growth of getting content from third parties. All of the really large publishers are doing third-party publishing of some of the smaller society and associations. So while we might just have a single agreement with Elsevier or Wiley, they are providing to us all of the content for these smaller entities that are using them as their publishing arm. So that is a way that we've been able to get more content from these small publishers into the archives. Also removing some of the barriers, specifically technical barriers. One way we've done that is, for example, we both have mechanisms through OJS, Open Journal System, which is a common way for some very small journals, especially those coming out of academic institutions, to make their content available. We've made plugins available for them, and on Portico's side, we're always kind of thinking about if there are further things we can do to perhaps minimize what we require publishers to supply to us in terms of the content, and also whether or not there's ways that we can take a more active role in trying to get some of that content in rather than putting the onus on the small publishers. But there's probably a little bit more work to do there. And so what we've started looking more towards here is seeking out publishers for collaboration to help us prioritize this work and help us with ideas on how we might tackle more of the long tail in terms of getting the content into the archive. Because as you've seen from some of these other examples I've listed, like using known platforms, leveraging the existing relationships, trying to remove some of the technical barriers, the one thing that is missing is really anything that is helping us understand what the libraries most want to see preserved, or either by what they're telling us directly or what they're telling us by things that CRL has gathered, which is by how many libraries are choosing to catalog certain items or consider them parts of their collection. So we view an important collaboration is CLOCKSS and Portico working with CRL and using the CRL Critical Corpus project that they did for print as a model for doing data-centered prioritization for digital preservation. So some of the things that we've talked about amongst CRL, CLOCKSS, and Portico as ways to leverage and expand on the data that CRL has already gathered is to analyze the e-serial titles that are not on the CRL list but are not archived in CLOCKSS and Portico. We've done a little bit of poking around on this, but we have to kind of take a closer look at what's showing up on the list. We have a couple of ideas for engaging the community more broadly. We'd like to explore the idea of hosting a scholar's evaluation of the critical corpus methodology and plan. We'd like to find some financial support for having a project that could allow us to expand and refine the list of titles and publishers that we're looking at. We'd also like to investigate and execute on ways to engage the community more broadly. We particularly would like to hear from the library community about ways to refine the list, correct the list, and eliminate false positives. The criteria for getting put on the list as having a digital presence was based on some of the fields in the MARC records having particular things in them. The 776 field, if it had a note about an electronic presence, that included a title on the list. And if the 856 field had a URL that included the title on the list, that may or may not have given us the proper list of titles to look at. So getting feedback from the community and doing more research on our own to help narrow that down and remove false positives will be a big step. Other ways in which we need to refine and prioritize the list of titles for preservation is to figure out the importance of titles. One way to do that is to see which are the most widely held titles based on the CRL data. Also, on the flip side of that is the most endangered titles, and those are the ones that are least widely held based on the CRL data that fewer people might be paying attention to and maybe have less support for those journals in general to remain online. So we want to make sure that's preserved so the content does not go away. There's also an aspect of this that we can get more titles preserved the more we're able to work with publishers that have more than one title. So we kind of have to look at this from a bunch of different ways to try to get to a strategy that will allow us to get as much coverage of the meaningful long tail as possible. So we're here today to talk about collaborative approaches, and you know, the ultimate goal of this collaboration that CRL, CLOCKSS, and Portico are talking about is that we want to develop a prioritized list of the titles to pursue, and then, most importantly, create an actual plan of action to help us pursue these top priority titles. We really do want to make headway in this space and be meeting the needs of the library community, to be making that headway in a way that is making sure we're preserving the content that libraries view to be most in need. So because of this, the input from the library community is crucial. We invite everybody here and spread it to your spread the word to your colleagues. We want to know your thoughts on what we've been presenting and talking about here. And we'd also like to know from you if you have other lists you think are important for us to be looking at, your own journal title lists, other third-party resources that we may not be aware of. We are also aware that there are some other projects out there in addition to the CRL Critical Corpus project that might benefit us. And we would like to expand our research into those areas as well. One of the things that we feel can provide a lot of useful information to us is the Keepers Registry. And I'm going to hand it over to Craig now, because he's going to talk a little bit about how we can use the data that Keepers has to help us with this prioritization of titles as well.
Thanks, Stephanie. So let's begin by advancing the slides. So first, I just want to say a couple more words about this infamous long tail. Among the long tail of very small publishers, there are some publishers who are known as having bad business practices, sometimes called predatory. And sometimes we know about that and sometimes we don't. So we do try to apply a certain level of vetting of publishers when they come to us or when we want to consider archiving them. So it's not sort of, the door is not completely widely open in that regard. And in the long tail, in particular, we do have our antenna out. We rely on trusted third parties. Beall's List, which is defunct, but it has been captured, so it's still a kind of reference resource, although it's getting older now. Cabell's has announced that they are tracking both a white and black list, and that is another resource that we use. And of course, we rely on input from librarians and researchers. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Keepers Registry, which reports on what journals are in what archives. It's developed by EDINA, which is located at the University of Edinburgh, together with the ISSN International Center. It was funded by JISC. It has archiving information for 36,000 titles from 13 different archiving organizations. These are the archiving organizations. You can see CLOCKSS and Portico are in there, as well as some others. These are all organizations that archive lots of journals. Some of them have a specific focus, like Cariniana is about Brazil. The Archaeology Data Service is obviously about archaeology. You see China, Switzerland, the Netherlands, the US, Britain in there. Scholars Portal is Canada. CLOCKSS and Portico, I think, are attempting to be comprehensive and global. So the Keepers Registry can help us to identify titles that are archived and are not. And there's also some sort of mining of the data that we can do to understand what might be the most important titles that are not being archived. Keepers has a prototype statistics portal, which I'll talk a little bit about. So you can submit a list of titles to the Keepers Registry, and it will give you results that tell you for each title where it is being archived. So for example, I don't know how well you can see it, but the first one in the results list says there's 4. That particular journal is in 4 different archives. The next one is in 4, the next one is in 6. Then there's some summary statistics that shows that 27% of the journals that were submitted on this particular list are not in any archive. So if you're concerned about preservation, those 27% become a kind of target. And this is just a kind of random example of submitting a list, a title list. The point is that if you're interested in a set of titles and whether they're being archived, you can go to this site and do your own, get statistics for that list that's of interest to you. There's also a statistics portal that is actually a prototype, but it is available for the public, so I show the URL here. And this uses UK Libraries holdings, somewhat similar to what CRL has done in terms of looking for overlaps in the holdings as a kind of proxy for quality. And then it gives archival status of those titles. So the statistics the statistics portal uses a UK thing called the Research Excellence Framework, and 2014 is the last one that has, whose data has been entered. And when a university submits information to the Research Excellence Framework, they give up to 4 research outputs for each staff member. And the whole purpose of this is to try to evaluate the excellence of that institution's research. Then these journals can be compared against what's in the Keepers Registry. So I need to get rid of something that's on my screen. All right. So this is an example. The Research Excellence Framework, if you break it down by subject, I'll just take the first line, which is classics. There were 371 classics journals that were included in the research outputs that were reported on by these many universities in the UK. Of those 371, 250 are in 1 or more archive, and 67 are in 3 or more archives. Keepers considers 3 to be sort of a key number. It's an appropriate level of redundancy. They call it keep safe. So out of this, using these classics journals, 67% are in an archive, and 18% are in 3 or more archives, and 33% are in no archive. And you probably can't see it, but there's a link there for download data. This is open data, so you can go here and get the detailed data about all 371 of these classics journals to find out which ones are archived where. And furthermore, there's also something called the OpenURL router, which is a service used by around 100 UK universities to direct users to an appropriate local resolver. Again, we can use this information to help to, as a kind of proxy for quality. So as an example, or to give some of the data here, in the year in question, there were 4 million accesses through the OpenURL router, and that included 51,000 ISSNs, or 51,000 serials. Of those 51,000 serials, 21,000 are in 1 or more archive, 12,000 are in 3 or more, so there's 18,000 that are not in any archive. And again, you can drill into this data to see which of these 51,000 journals were getting the most activity, which can be used as a proxy for quality. So if we say that we are interested in the 50% or so that are not in any archive, actually 60% that are not in any archive, we could go in and see of those 60%, which ones were getting the highest usage, and we could say, well, those then are to be prioritized for preservation, and they could work their way onto the hit list that we would like to develop using the tools that we've been discussing today and the approaches. So I think that's my last slide, and I'm going to hand it back to Amy to kind of take us to the finish line. Thank you.
So now we've come to the, I suppose the important part for us is we'd like to hear from you and whether or not you have any questions about some of the information that we've shared with you, or just your thoughts about ways of increasing the archives, our digital archives, in support of our scholarly material. So I might have to start calling on you. Yes. Hi.
Is this, oh, it is on, okay. Well, one of the outcomes we'd like to see is after we work through kind of like the data aspect of this, of getting the list sorted out and having some prioritization, is taking a look at, does it make more sense for certain publishers or content in a certain format to be pursued by CLOCKSS, and content from other types of publishers or in certain kinds of formats preserved by Portico. So we do want to look at that piece, because also for the very small publishers, it's far less possible to have your content preserved in multiple places than it is for the larger publishers. So it's something we're looking at. We don't have anything in place right now.
If I can just add to that, I'm not really fond of the phrase divide and conquer. What we don't want to do is divide up the market. Even though we're both not-for-profits, that's probably not good business practice. But working with CRL, we acknowledge that the task that we are setting for ourselves is challenging, and it doesn't actually make much sense for both organizations to go after the same titles, given that they're hard to get, and there's too many of them for either of us to get anyway. So using CRL as a kind of neutral third party or a forum to help us make a plan, we will look for a plan that seems reasonable so that we are approaching the preservation of the long tail in a reasonable manner. Yes, we will divide up the problem and conquer it.
Yes?
So we talked about trying to prioritize this list. I don't think I saw anything about using data to do that beyond what libraries hold. So think about Elsevier's data, think about Web of Science data, and it seems like that's a better approach to using things like Yields list, which I think is at best sketchy, and at worst, exclude a large population of the developing world. That may actually be the most interesting. I don't think they're publishers or Western countries. So maybe I missed that. Are you looking at using data and other types of sources beyond things that we've talked about?
Well, the URL resolver that I mentioned in the UK is such data. It maybe is not as comprehensive as some of the sources that you mentioned. I think if you're talking about Elsevier, you may be talking about Scopus. I haven't looked into to what degree is the long tail even represented in Scopus, and if it is, whether there is robust usage data. So that would be an interesting thing to find out, actually, is of these thousands of serials that we haven't captured, how many of them are covered in Scopus. So that was something we can look into.
And I think from CRL's perspective, you're right. It doesn't seem like a very scientific approach to just say, let's get a bunch of libraries and gather all their data, and that's the important thing. although we do have a certain amount of respect for the work that went into pulling together those collections, but we also know that there are things in there. I mean, if you look title by title, you know, I have to wonder, there are lots of journals about miming, I guess is the verb. And, you know, is that essential for the future? You know, there's a title called Monkey Bicycle. You know, if you go title by title, you do sort of wonder. But I think from CRL's perspective, we did feel a sense of urgency of just needing to get a substantial number and being able to pull together partners that could actually, without a lot of extra resources, commit to something, because they're probably already committed to a great deal of that information. But I think what you know, Stephanie was trying to emphasize was that CRL's approach, hopefully an important one, might not be the only one. And we do need to spend some time now sort of evaluating not whether or not that approach is necessary, because I think it's an okay approach. I think it's a fine approach to include, but whether or not we need other approaches to, you know, sort of deepen the effort or strengthen the effort. I think that is an important point, and I think part of why CRL is here is I think we're hoping that the digital will creep into the print, that we know what we have in print, we have to get it into digital form, and how will that eventually get in that. But I'll let Stephanie.
I mean, I would just say that we're starting with this list that comes from the CRL Critical Corpus project. That is based on print holdings originally, and then we're just extrapolating it out to what of those titles also exist in digital form. That's our starting point. We're just at the beginning of trying to investigate working this way. So I think there's plenty of opportunity as we continue with this to think about other sources of information that might be more useful to specifically looking at digital resources and giving a weight to them.
Well, I think that's it. So thank you very much again for attending and for the questions. I think they will give us a lot to think about as we go forward with trying to put together a plan. So thank you.